Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural session of Nagarro's Sommelier Series. And this series puts together two speakers each time. And the two speakers on tonight's billing are Justin Ferrell, who's a bit of a rock star in the topic of organization design, and especially design thinking as applied to organization design, and me, Manas Fuloria. I'm on the billing as a speaker, but my role today is mainly to ask questions and as a student and pretty much parse what is being said by Justin because he's really the expert on the topic. Uh, and you all too can ask questions. You can put your questions in the questions window. And at the end of our discussion of 45 minutes, we will come to those questions and address them with Justin. So Justin, thanks very much for joining this session. It's really a privilege to have you here. Maybe you could start off by saying a few words about yourself and what excites you about this topic.
Sure. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Manas. Thank you, Nagarro. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name's Justin Ferrell. I'm based in California, in the heart of Silicon Valley, joining now from Palo Alto, where it's nice, beautiful morning here so far. And I get a chance to help people in a lot of different types of organizations around the world. I am based at Stanford University at the Institute of Design, which we call the D School, which is really one of the birthplaces of design thinking. And for me, it's about applying this human-centered approach to organizational change. So who are the people within the organization that you want to influence new behaviors in order to create opportunity to create new outcomes? And I sort of come to this work. I was a journalist for most of my life. I spent most of my career in journalism at the Washington Post. And if any of you are in journalism, you know that the news never stops. There is always more things happening, and it can be a very difficult career where there's project after project after project after project. And one thing I realized during my time at the Post was that for me, it was really about the people that I got to work with. When I shifted my focus to be about how can I bring my skills at the same level as the investigative reporters I get to work with, or the amazing photographers, or the graphics editors, right? And a place like the Post, you're talking about some of the most talented people in that field in the world, right? And so an incredible challenge for me to be as prolific at the design of that content and those products as they are at the content that they create. And when I shifted my focus to really be about the people, how are we working together? How are we building trust? How are we interacting with each other? Who's working together? How do we assemble multidisciplinary teams and then own our expertise at the same level of quality and care? An interesting thing happened for me is that I started to create more meaningful projects, right? And so I have this sort of mantra, it's people before projects. And the more you focus on the people you're working with and how you're working with them, the more you're able to create things that might be beyond your own aspirations. And that's been the case for me and has continued at Stanford, where I continue to be just surrounded by amazing people doing amazing things. So that's my background. I've been teaching here now for almost 10 years, and specifically on design thinking applied to organization design. How do you build room for risk within companies and organizations in order to get to different outcomes? So thank you.
That's great. That's great. Washington Post and Stanford D School are pretty much the pinnacles of their respective sort of areas. It's just great to have you. Maybe a few words about Nagarro and about myself. We come at this as a tech services company. Nagarro makes digital products and services for our clients. And these are some of the world's leading companies. The real exciting thing about us is that we get to touch these great, amazing companies in different industries and on different topics every single day. And it also leads to a lot of pressure. And that's kind of what I'm coming to regarding organizational design, because we are a company that has scaled from roughly 1,000 people in 2011 to 10,000 people today. And as you scale, how do you keep that intimacy? How do you adapt? How do you make sure that your teams are really delivering? It's very difficult to do this across different client sizes, across 50 countries where we operate, across all kinds of new changing technologies, etc. Difficult beast to manage and deliver value and a differentiated experience, right? So that's kind of got us thinking about organization design. And I must say that's really front and center for us. That's what we do every single day, especially in the senior management, and especially me, myself, in my role. That's what we think about every single day. So that's a quick, summary about Nagarro and myself. And I had a short exposure to design thinking when I was back at Stanford, and at that time it was all very confusing for me. I didn't really understand this ambidextrous thinking and this sort of weird kind of educational model. And then in the years that sort of followed, it gradually sort of began to dawn on me that something interesting had happened back there. And today I would say that the one course, the 3-part course that I took on this topic over 9 months was perhaps the best course I've ever taken, right? And
Wow.
it took a long time to come to that realization, right? But anyway, so great to have you here, and let's just dive into the questions, maybe, Justin, and really look forward to your thoughts, right?
Wonderful. Thanks.
So the first question is sort of driven a bit by my observation, even 25 years ago when I started out in consulting, that companies start to get good at 1 or 2 or 3 things and then become really good at this stuff, right? Uh, and as a result, they don't need to be as good at thing number 4 and 5 and 6. And all of a sudden, there is a lack of even innovation or thinking. And even in the things that they're really good at, it tends to become siloed, right? So maybe some of the assumptions that were made when you set up this process or this way of thinking or this way of local optimization have changed, right? Things are changing around you, and people don't see the change. They don't talk to each other about change. But so the question really is that, on one hand, you have this sort of creativity, innovation, etc. On the other hand, you have this very real pressure for efficiency and churning stuff out, keeping that flywheel going, generating revenues and profits, quarter after quarter or year after year. So how do you see these two in opposition to each other, or are they in opposition to each other?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I think a common issue, especially for folks who have become market leaders, right? So first, I would say that I'm a learner, and one of the great things for me and the environment I'm in is all the people that I get to learn from. So as I learn about different frameworks and ways to articulate the problem space or the intention behind what we're trying to do, my opinion is that these frameworks don't have the answers. They give us a way to develop a shared language, right? And whatever language works for you in the culture of your organization, whatever resonates, right? That's the language that you should use, because the more you have a shared language and a common understanding, that language is the basis for your communication, which is therefore the basis of your collaboration, right? So one of the issues with scaling around the world is, are you using the same language to mean the same things? How do you build trust within those teams and understanding? So when you ask this question, one of the frameworks that's become sort of shared language for me comes from a mentor of mine at Stanford, a professor at the business school named Charles O'Reilly. And Charles has this concept of the ambidextrous organization, right? That organizations need to continuously improve and continuously innovate on their core products and services and experiences, right? The things that have made them a viable organization in the first place, that have led to their success. But the more you become efficient in the creation of those things, the more vulnerable you are to disruption, right? And this resonates with me because in the newspaper industry, right? The newspaper industry is a great example. We became very highly efficient at creating a brand new newspaper every single day, right? No time off for holidays or weekends or anything, right? Every day you're starting with a blank. Well, hopefully there's advertisement in it, but you're starting with, an empty product and you're filling it with the news of the day and other enterprise work, and then you're shipping it out, right? So it's very, high volume product creation. But the more efficient we became in that way of working, the more vulnerable we became to the internet or different distribution systems of news, right? So in Charles's model, it's he and Michael Tushman from Harvard talk about the core as really marked by exploitation of your resources toward a predetermined target, right? You know what it is you create, and now you're taking your resources, you're deploying them toward that target, trying to improve your precision and consistency with hitting the target, right? With the margin that you need to achieve for your business, okay? But on the other side, they talk about how do you come up with new products? How do you differentiate your revenue stream at the same time that you're focused on your core? And this is really difficult for organizations because the skills that make you good at optimizing the core are not the same skills that make you good at exploring what might be possible. So exploit versus explore is sort of one spectrum that O'Reilly articulates in the ambidextrous organization. So part of what I do is take the methods of design thinking and then map those onto the ambidextrous organization, right? So if you say, we're trying to focus on incremental innovation on the core, then we want to work in this way. If we're focused on exploring what might be possible, we want to work in this way. I think a lot of business school professors have their own language for this kind of corporate innovation. But to me as a learner, it's pretty much the same thing. I think, different language it helps with different titles and things like that. But nothing against business school professors. I love them. But another model that resonates with me, which I see really similarly, is Clay Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma, right? And Clay Christensen is such a wonderful teacher and a wonderful man, very generous man. And he talked about how when you become a market leader, the biggest challenge that you have to disrupting yourself is that you have customers. And because you have customers, because you are a viable business, right, you can only work on the future part-time because you have to, deliver in the present. And your potential competitors, right, newcomers to your domain, because they don't have customers, they're focused on the future full-time because they have to figure out where the market is going. And so this is the dilemma, right? How do you get better at the present and explore the future at the same time? And this is where the ambidextrous org framework comes in. And what I've seen over and over again is managers, especially middle and getting into upper management, are often asked to do both at the same time, right? Guide and direct your team to get better at what you're responsible for year over year or quarter over quarter, and also tell us, what the future looks like. And I think that's nearly impossible to do them simultaneously, because all of the inbound, all of the meetings we have every day, all of the pressure, most of the tangible outputs, the KPIs and things that we're measuring ourselves against are on the present, right? Because you can't really put that ROI in the future. It's hard to predict the ROI of something that doesn't yet exist. And so everything pulls us back to, it'd be nice to focus on the future, but I have a lot to do right now. I'm pretty overwhelmed. It's not like I just peel off my Fridays to think about the future. And also there's a whiplash between planning and executing toward a predetermined outcome versus generating ideas and incubating ones that show promise, right? So again, the skills are different. And so asking people to lead in that way simultaneously, I think is essentially it's virtually impossible task, right? So now, how do we build room to explore within our main mechanism of exploiting, and how do we achieve the right balance at the right time for us, which we can talk more about how I consider what the right balance is. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that was great. I kept thinking of different things. I first thought you were going to focus on Stanford professors to the exclusion of Harvard professors, but I've been really, some of the things that you said just resonated with me. I think a lot of our work on Nagarro's organizational positioning and design started with Vishal Gaur of Cornell. Actually, he happens to be a batchmate. I asked him, I said, what makes a great company? And he said, a great company is one which from top to bottom and all across the company, everyone has the same idea of what this company is. And then he started to talk about Toyota. And Toyota, of course, it created a whole culture, a whole new culture, just in time, Kanban, single minute exchange of dies. So technical stuff, cultural stuff, and left a lot of room for innovation, still in the structure, but Kaizen and continuous improvement and all of that.
Hmm.
cell manufacturing, people, multi-skilling and all of that, right? So that's what got us started. And then, some of the things that you talked about, these companies that the innovator's dilemma, right? I saw it firsthand. We were a small company working with large retailers in the US, not as Nagarro, it's one of my startups. And we saw Zara, Inditex Zara, at
Hmm.
that time, still a small, tiny company, doing things completely differently. They
Hmm.
were going from design to in-store in a couple of weeks versus, let's say, the Gap, which would take 9 months or 12 months.
Hmm.
And and that's what my PhD ended up being finally. But it was very apparent that they had a completely different view. They had innovated a whole new paradigm, right?
Hmm.
And still, despite our and many others, pitching to these large retailers, that this change is around the corner, we had exactly, the same sort of reaction that there's so much of our current business to milk. This is too far from where we are, right? And this will be niche. Today, of course, Zara Inditex is the world's largest apparel retailer, and its market cap is even, several times the multiple that its revenues are over the others.
Hmm.
And that was just in front of us. We saw that play out. But I still feel, right, just because maybe it's more got to do with some certain human conviction that maybe we can do, each person can do both of these things, right?
Yeah.
Milk the present and work on the future. So at Nagarro, we try to maximize the ability of people to do both, right? And that brings me actually to my next question. But before I get there, let me first just welcome again people who may have joined late. This is I'm Manas Fuloria speaking with Justin Ferrell on design thinking applied to organizational design. And yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the question box. We'll come to them in a bit. But that's what I just mentioned, Justin. About Nagarro, right?
Hmm.
We feel that people can do both, right? And this has been sort of a religion for us, right?
Hmm.
Uh, Maybe we don't do either very well, right? But you know,
I don't
it's
think
always
that's
possible,
true.
right? Uh, but it's a bit like it's very easy to say I'm going to put together a small team that's going to be innovation is going to reside here, or
Hmm.
consulting is going to reside here.
Hmm.
It's far more difficult to try to change the culture of an entire organization.
Hmm.
And yet that is what we are trying. So how do you think about that? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. So I also think that everyone can do both or should have the opportunity to do both. I think the intentionality is around not asking people to do it simultaneously, but actually episodically, right? So we're going to pull you off of your frontline work on the core because you've spotted something in those responsibilities that could be an opportunity for us, right? And so now we're going to give you a chance to explore that opportunity for X amount of time, right? And as we do that, in order to mitigate the risk of trying something that we're not sure how it's going to turn out, right? We want you to sort of prototype the idea in order to devote resources as it shows promise, right? So when we talk about organizational change, the prototyping mindset that a lot of folks are familiar with around products and services, it's the same mindset, right? So in the same way that you wouldn't, spend the full budget to create a product that you're unsure about and then ship it and hope it does well, you don't want to totally shift your organization without, being able to learn as you go. So we're going to try this for 2 weeks, right? You have an idea, we're going to pull you out of this, you're going to try it for 2 weeks. What you learn in that 2 weeks is either going to prove or disprove whether you should continue with it, why you should get another 2 weeks, right? And remember, when we're prototyping organizational change and products, either one, right, it's as important to stop prototyping something that doesn't show promise as it is to continue with something, right? So we're not just trying to confirm, our assumptions or our bias, right? Because if we stop something early enough, we're preserving resources for the things that do show promise, right? And resources are not infinite. So I think it's an episodic opportunity, right? But the other thing to remember too is that I think, whether we're working on the core or whether we're exploring the new, these are complementary in an organization, right? The core work is extremely important, especially in successful organizations, because this is where the revenue comes from. This is often where the resources come from to be able to explore in the first place, right? And I don't know if this is just a human trait or what, but I think we tend to overpraise the sort of innovation labs or the idea generators, right? Because we get really excited about new ideas, right? And it's not that we want to curb that excitement, but we don't want to create, a rift in the company where people who are doing the traditional work of the company are sort of looking over there and saying, why are they getting all the praise when in fact their failure rate is super high? Well, of course it's super high because they're exploring something that has been done. So I think that's another challenge. I sometimes joke, like if you look back at these lists that come out in sort of the innovation press of, these are the most creative companies in the world, or these are the most creative people in the world, and look back 5 years ago and see how many of those companies are still in business, right? Like, we're glorifying the new ideas, but that doesn't mean that they are viable or sustainable as businesses. And so same thing happens in our organization. So of course, as a leader of an organization, that this is complementary, right? This is a whole. So how do we all feel as if we're a part of moving the company toward the future? And even just from a rational perspective, right? What you discover on the new side, if it is a great idea for a product or service, you want to optimize it on the core, right? You want to then take advantage of it. And so that can't be a stark handoff, or else it probably won't have the same impact in the market that you're after. So these things are fluid, right? This moving between one and the other, the connective tissues between one and the other, what you learn from one to apply to the other, right? These are fluid. And I think that's really where it gets tricky for most people, because there's not one answer. And again, the frameworks don't have the answers for your organization. They give you a way to articulate the why, right? Here's what we're doing and why, and bring everybody onto the same page so that you're aligned around your intention. But in that core versus new framework, I think in Charles O'Reilly's work with large companies around the world, he found that the resource allocation split was something like 97% devoted to exploitation to your core business, and like 3% devoted to explore on average. And people ask me, well, what's the right percentage? And I always say, well, there is no right percentage. It depends on your advantage, right? If you have a clear advantage in the market and you're the first ones there, then you want to exploit that advantage. You may devote 99% of your resources to that. But as you start to see competition emerge, or factors beyond your control affecting your business, right? Technology or global health or climate, whatever it may be, then you want to explore more. And I use this, core versus new as a framework for sort of case studies. Like, you can look at companies like Apple and say, wow, they were really focused on exploiting for a long time, and now they've moved into streaming and original content. They're like going after Netflix and others, and so they're hiring different types of folks and they're exploring more. Or you look at a company like Tesla and you say, wow, they were really great at exploring, but they could not figure out how to manufacture their cars, right? And if they didn't figure that out, they didn't figure out how to optimize that advantage, then their legacy would have been that they moved traditional, automobile manufacturers into electric vehicles, which is great, right, for the world. But they have figured that out now, and so now, so it's complementary, right? And so be careful when you are giving people the opportunity that it doesn't feel like, well, this is the fun stuff now. Okay, you've been working really hard on the hard stuff. Now you get to do the fun stuff, right? It's more about, aligning people to be fit for purpose. Some people want to know what the target is they're trying to hit, and they want to execute toward that target, and that's where their strengths are. And Charles talks a lot about this. How do you, if you can identify the traits in the type of work, then you can align the people who work in the company to be able to do their best work every day. And that's another thing you're after as a leader.
Yeah. It's one thing to allocate correctly, but I think the other thing which you want to do is to allow people to stretch. And these are not always. Sometimes there's a bit of a tension between these two aspects. But what I take away from this is the idea of episodic sort of switching between exploitation of the core strengths of the company versus more exploration. And of course, we all know that having the strict KPIs for killing off ideas and making these are all a bunch of hygiene things that are very difficult to get right in practice because it's but I think most people who run companies and have started projects like this, companies or divisions or teams, they know what we're talking about there. So Justin, you spoke a bit about emergent systems in a video that I was watching in preparation for this call. And
Yes.
I loved that because why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because I saw some very strong parallels with how we think of Nagarro and how you were thinking of or talking about emergent systems. So maybe a few words on that.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for asking. As I said before, I like to soak up what I can learn from people around me and then apply it in new situations. I think that all that training as a journalist helps me figure out how to, gather information and then deploy it. And so emergent systems, what I know about that, I learned from a good friend and former colleague, George Kimball, who was the founding executive director of the D School at Stanford. And if you think about emergent systems versus hierarchical systems, so emergent systems are simple systems that when replicated become complex, right? There's a great book by Stephen Johnson, who's a wonderful author like social sciences and things like that, called Emergence, which talks about how ants in a colony operate, right? And how cities, the collision of people and ideas yields more ideas, right? So what are these systems and what is the idea outcome from this, focusing on the behaviors within the system? So what I learned from George is essentially about looking at a school of fish. And if you look at a picture of a school of fish, I'll show this all the time in my lectures with students and others. And I'll say, hey, there are 1,000 fish here, right? But if you're trying to lead this 1,000 fish system from a hierarchical sort of industrial age assembly line mentality, right? Which is how a lot of traditional organizations are structured, right? Because it grew out of the sort of manufacturing, you do your part, the next group will do their part. It's a linear way of working, right? But we know this type of innovation on the explore side, it's non-linear, right? We're trying something, we're deploying what we learn, we're trying something else, we're trying to get to a place that we couldn't have imagined at the outset, so there's no way it's linear. So anyway, so if you look at a school of fish, 1,000 fish, rather than managing that from fish number 701 to 800, this is your department and here's your task, and fish number 801 to 900, this is your department, and we'll meet somewhere down the line. It's actually an emergent system, which is a 5-fish system replicated 200 times. So it's still 1,000 fish total, but it's a different mentality in how you lead for an emergent system versus the hierarchical one. Okay. And the hierarchical one, you're prescribing the target, you're moving the team toward that target. And an emergent one, you don't know what the outcome is going to be, right? Because if you knew the outcome before you got started, it's probably not something that's never been done, right? So you're deploying, again, this on the explore side. We're exploring possibilities. We can't possibly know what the outcomes are going to be because none of us can successfully predict the thing that doesn't exist that's going to change the future, right? So what we can do is know what we're going to do next. And if we know what we're going to do next and we try that thing, then what we learn from that will determine what we do next and so forth. So really what we're focused on now is we're saying, I don't know where we're going to end up, team, but I have a way for us to get there, right? Which sounds counterintuitive, but that's actually how design thinking works. So you have this 5-fish system, and now you're articulating the behaviors. How do people engage with each other within this system? Well, for fish, I learned this from George. Essentially, it's 3 things, right? Maintain equal distance between you and the fish next to you, something they're born with. And then 2 things determine direction. Look for food, which all animals need, and avoid being food, right? Avoid predators. And that's more important than finding food. So you're swimming along, you look for food, you see some, you turn, all the other fish maintain distance. You see a predator, you turn away, all the fish maintain distance, right? And this is how, in a series of micro interactions, replicated out, this school of fish looks like a cloud underwater and has a macro effect on the ocean. So when I teach this course I developed with a colleague at Stanford called Designing Creative Organizations, we teach from this perspective that emergent systems are accelerated by technology, right? If you think about the platforms that have become super successful, right? It's really about designing for the interactions of the customers on the platform toward a particular outcome, right? So, there's the joke of, The world's largest consumer goods company doesn't really manufacture many consumer goods, right? It's Amazon. The world's largest, taxi company doesn't own any cars. World's largest hotel company doesn't have real estate, right? So they're designing for the interactions versus the market that we're trying to get to as customers. And so there's a parallel there with how, schools of fish operate and other aspects of nature, ants and others. So anyway, so the point is, it's looking at small teams, and then rather than adding people to those teams as that team shows promise, which would be sort of a hierarchical way of rewarding, instead it's about replicating. So you have the same number of people, but you're taking 3 teams of 5 instead of 15 people, because every person that you add when you're working in an area that you haven't worked in before, right? So you're trying to hold on to risk, you're trying to navigate the uncertainty of that process. Every person you add makes it harder to hold that uncertainty, because all of us want to know where we're going to end up, right? Okay. So anyway, that's essentially the emergence concept, which I think is just super fascinating and also feels really good, right? Because it feels a little bit like, wow, as technology develops, maybe it's bringing us closer to the organizational systems of nature.
Yeah, right? Yeah, I completely believe that. So the way I sort of processed it, I mean, before the video, actually, just in general, was that, if you had to build the pyramids in 3000 BC, when human beings were puny and weak, and there was a huge amount of work to be done, right?
Yeah.
Then you had to be hierarchical. You had to sort of create a structure, right? On the other hand, with technology and with innovation, each individual has a lot more to add. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that whole idea of hierarchy has less meaning, right? And it's funny, but I just love that video when you said this, because when I'm in investor calls and investors say, "So, what is your strategy for this year?" Right? Mm-hmm. What's your technology strategy for this year? Even more direct, and I just have to say, I don't make strategy. I don't know what strategy is. It'll form, right? There are so many people who are far more intelligent than I am about verticals and technologies, and the shape will get created, right?
Yes.
And that's how we think of Nagarro as well. And we think of ourselves as 10,000 people in the 2 pizza teams that Amazon talks about, which is
2 pizzas,
beyond 2 pizzas. You're probably either eating too much or too large a team, right? So that's kind of the way we think about it. And I think if you go back to the history of Agile or the Agile Manifesto, and some of that culture is there in the tech world, in that part of the tech world anyway, because it's starting to recognize. You can see that 20 years ago or 15 years ago, you can start to see that realization that the old hierarchical ways don't really work for this sort of new world. Mm-hmm. And many of our clients, most of our clients, the parts that we work with are technology teams. And, I think they are figuring this out as well. I know teams becoming more and more agile, many more less and less hierarchical, coming together in more modern ways. So it's a fascinating area. But in the Nagarro context, at least, I feel the balance, the need for balance, right? And let me just explain that, right?
Yeah.
So on one hand, you have these 2 pizza teams, right? And they're all over the world, and they're all distributed, and different verticals, different topics, working for large clients and small startups and all kinds of things, right? Mm-hmm. But what is the common value or thread that runs through all of them? What's the algorithm for your school of fish, right? Who decides the algorithm, right?
Right.
So without going as deeply into it as Zappos did, for example, it was very concept, very theoretical. Yes. We do have a few things that bind the company together, but we even get pushed back on those things, right? Like, you have an allocation policy that runs through the company, and that's a bit hierarchical, right? Or a bit that's a bit rigid, right? So it's an interesting balance. I think that's a fascinating thought. But now coming now to the idea of change, right? So we talked about organizations and how the emergent systems might be a model for some organizations. Now, let's say I'm out to change my organization, and I need each individual fish, to behave differently, right? Each individual person in the organization to behave differently. So coming down to the individual level, how would you go about it? What do you prescribe that they do? What do you suggest to them? What do you say they should not do? What are the anti-patterns? How do you think about it? Because organization change finally
Mm.
ends up being individual change as well, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
any
for
thoughts on
sure.
that?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I would say, like, for us in education, this design thinking way of working, right? Which even we kind of move, we define that more broadly than maybe the consultancy market does, right? But this way of working, be human centered, connect with the people you're trying to serve in order to bring them into the framing of the problem you're trying to solve, right? And increasingly, it's about co-creation. How do you bring them into the process? um, rapidly prototype, learn as you go. Like, these are the local behaviors for us. These are the ways that we interact with each other and our teams and interact with the world. And that's the reason why this way of working has scaled. It's not because, David Kelly, who's an amazing person who just totally changed my life and the lives of many others, founder of the D School. It's not like he sat down and said, hey, in 10 years, we're going to teach 80 classes and here are all the topics, right? It's here's how we're going to interact with each other and how we're going to interact with the world. And so part of the issue of, like, prescribing those behaviors, like you mentioned, or alluded to, holacracy. Part of the issue with prescribing those behaviors is that then they don't necessarily evolve as people put them into practice, right? How do the fish themselves help the behaviors evolve? And this is kind of where we are and have been as a team at the D School, right? My personal journey is starting with the curriculum that I learned first as a student there. I was a journalism fellow and I took a bunch of classes there. And so learning this new behavior and sort of taking it off the shelf. But now, as I've worked there, it's adapting these things that I've learned to create new methods and new ways of working that still have the same core principles, but different tools, different, approaches, and so forth, in the area that I care most about, with organizational change. So yes, that's a huge challenge. And then back to your point is, if you're in this discovery or exploration mode and you're as a leader, helping to facilitate these behaviors that, again, the crowd, like what you're saying, the crowd is always going to have more ideas than the individual, right? And I don't know if it's age that helps us realize that, or experience, or, less worry about where we fit in the world or an organization, after we've worked for a while, or, whatever it may be. But the older I get, the more I realize, like, I just have my set of ideas. The more I can enable ideas in people around me, or generation of ideas, the more interesting ideas will emerge, right? But as you do that, then you may discover, oh, we need to build this amazing structure. And now you want to work in a different way because you know what you're trying to achieve. And so that's that sort of back and forth between the explore and exploit. But you're right. So to me, and this is the area that I care most about, is really about what are the human behaviors? How are we feeling? And when I'm helping people bring change to their organizations, or when I was doing this myself in journalism, to me, it's about using rational language, first of all, to help people step out of their comfort zone, right? So one of the places I love to start is with one of David's concepts around creative confidence, right? Which is one of the things we talk about at the D School.
I loved that particular part in that video. I mean, those were I think I'll remember those for the rest of my life. The three things you talked about. I don't know if you always use 3 points. I'll remember those for the rest of my life.
Oh,
Go
that's
ahead. Go
great.
ahead.
Yeah. Well, so again, so David Kelly has a book with his brother Tom called Creative Confidence. This is what he really cares most about, is helping people step into their own creativity and believe that you are creative, right? And the research term is creative self-efficacy. So if self-efficacy is the belief that you can accomplish what you set out to do, then creative self-efficacy, the belief you can accomplish what you set out to do, even though you've never done it before, or in a way that you've never done before. Okay. And we believe that that can be learned, right? That's not innate, or doesn't have to be innate, right? You can, through a series of small successes, right, start to get comfortable being uncomfortable, believe that you can try something different in order to create something that you haven't created before, right? And that feeling about ourselves as individuals is sort of paramount to then putting it into practice, right? So when you believe in your creative self-efficacy, now you start to want to work with other people in that way, other people who also have creative confidence. And now we're doing this, in teams, some of these small schools of fish, like we were talking about. And that work is what we call creative agency. So there's this fantastic model, comes from a friend of mine named Adam Royalty. I like to tell people where the information comes from because it's not just out of my head. And Adam is a design researcher. He's at Columbia University now, was at Stanford. And he has this model where from the internal, right? Do I believe that I can try something different to create something that hasn't been done? And this is the rational language I'm talking about, right? So you can talk to a room full of folks. You can say, hey, if we want to create something new in our organization, then we have to try something different, right? We can't do the same things we've always done and expect a different outcome. That's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again. So we have to do something different. Now, if we do something different, that's going to be uncomfortable because it's uncomfortable for all of us to step out of what we know. And in many cases, sort of what we've built our own self-image around, right? Like, I'm a really good journalist, and try something different. That's uncomfortable. We also are inevitably going to make mistakes anytime we try something we haven't done before. So let's think of those mistakes not as failures, but as learning. So now we're embracing a learn as you go, experiential learning methodology, right? So this is some of the language I use in my teaching because people will agree with that, right? Like you're nodding, right? Yeah, we have to try something different. But now when we actually do it, it's pretty hard, right? Because it's uncomfortable, right?
Yeah. And I love the way, just to jump in, right? I love the way
please.
you actually pointed out the kind of discomfort, right? So one of those points was that the confidence to share unfinished work. And I know all engineers would feel it right away because we don't want to share unfinished work. We want to just come out with the end product, right? And that's all. They don't look at it until we are done, right?
Right.
And there were a couple of other things, familiarity with, or being comfortable with ambiguous situations, and
right.
And I think the other thing which really struck me was your point that being that artistic ability is not the same as creativity. I mean, it's obvious, but we all think that we are not artistic, so we are not creative, right?
Right.
So I think these small words and phrases, they allow us to understand that even if you're not artistic, we can learn the creative process, and then we can also start to work on things like sharing unfinished work that is just so difficult for us. And I told this to my son, who's 12 years old, and he's really bad at sharing unfinished work, and he just laughed. He got it right away. And he was really good. I think it'll help him in his life to have seen that video and heard that little phrase. It'll help him in his life because it's a thing to learn. We have to learn it.
It is.
Right?
It is. Well, and that's like part of the prototyping mindset is when you share unfinished work, one of the sort of magical pieces of it is it changes the way other people can engage with you, right? So if you only share your finished work and you ask people what they think, they're more likely to be in an analytical state, right? I like this, I don't like this, right? Whereas if you show work in progress, you're inviting people in to be your collaborator. Hey, what do you think we should try next? The resolution is lower, right? So it's obviously not fully, realized. And so now people can say, now they become your collaborators, right? Rather than, just giving you the green light or not, right? And so that's all part of that prototyping mindset. I know one of the things that's so amazing about focusing on these behaviors is one, I think using this sort of rational language to say, hey, we know this is going to be uncomfortable, but now we're going to do this together because we know this is the only way to create something. So now we're looking at it not as sort of a personal, deficit, right? Like, oh, I'm just not creative. Now we're looking at it with optimism, right? Hey, let's try this thing and see what happens. And that optimism is really sort of sometimes the fuel that pushes you through the uncertainty, right? You're saying, wow, I have this chance to do something different rather than, oh, I don't want to make a mistake. And it's just a mindset. And that mindset grows when you're doing it together rather than as an individual, right? So Adam's framework is really cool because he talks about from self-efficacy at the individual level, comes agency at the team level, comes output, the thing that you're making in this different way. And again, this is all on the explore side. We don't know what the outcome is before we start. And then from output becomes impact in the world. And what I love about it is just a super simple sort of roadmap for how it is an internal to external process, right? So if you are a CEO of a company and you say, we want to be an innovative company, you're really talking about the impact in the world and having products and services that are at the edge of your industry. If you want to continuously create those things, then what are you doing to incentivize personal risk? How are you helping your employees step into believe their self-efficacy and then put it into practice, right? And this then gets to some of that episodic opportunity that we talked about before.
And actually, that's why, when I say CEO for myself, it's not chief executive officer, but custodian of entrepreneurship in the organization. And, we are very far from having accomplished it, but at least I'm aware that this is out there and that's where we need to go. And we as a company are very aware of it. And so it's very uncomfortable, by the way. It's
very uncomfortable.
Every time a new person joins you, they are, especially a senior person, they want to just go back to the hierarchy and the structure, and to sort of build an organization that is that where everyone feels that they have the ability. That's why I pushed back a bit on the ability to innovate, ability to create. We want everyone to feel that they have that ability to create in this organization. And it's, of course, a bit of an aspiration to but to get it right, but we keep at it. But one quick question, right? We are running short of time. I could talk for hours. Right?
Me too. This is so fun.
But I do want to take some of the other people's questions, or the viewers' questions. Maybe one last question from my side, right? Before I switch to the viewers' questions. Creativity versus productivity, right? So, I mean, somebody's being creative. How do you know that they're actually working and they're not just dozing off? Just a very practical question. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It depends a lot on what you're measuring within the creative process, right? And there are actually a lot of things that can be quantified. It's, how many ideas are you generating? How many, like in my language, how many, empathy interviews have you done? How many parallel prototypes are you running, right? So those are all numeric. You can set benchmarks for those. In fact, another mentor colleague here, Bob Sutton, he has this idea around the exploration funnel, right? That when you're generating ideas for things that haven't been done before, you're on the explore side. You're not going from problem to solution, because if you try to go from 0 to 1 or 0 to 2, those 1 or 2 are probably not going to be things that have never been done, right? You're actually going to 4,000. You're creating a body of ideas, and then you're chipping away at them to get to the ones that show promise. I think of it as like a sculptor. A sculptor doesn't start with nothing and then build a statue. You start with the rock, or the marble or whatever it is, and you chip away at it to get to the beauty inside. And that's the different mindset, right? So you could say, how many ideas have we generated in this amount of time? Do we have 4,000 ideas yet? How many prototypes has that yielded? 240 prototypes, right? So you can put those, kind of time constraint benchmarks in there. And then of course there's overtime. How many of these things reach the market? What was the application back to the core? How did it help us evolve? Things like that. But one of the things I think is also really interesting is how do you measure some of the intangibles? How do you measure, employee retainment? How do you measure recruiting, right? How do you measure, right? Because when you start to apply these ways of working, it affects your culture, right? And then your culture, has its own value, right? So what kind of ROI do you put on culture? I don't have all the answers for that. I've seen some interesting models for that, but I think you have to measure it. Otherwise, you're just sort of spinning around. You throw people in a lab and come out 5 years later and tell us what the future is like. I think that's an antiquated approach.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's another thing I take away, which is sort of measuring the even the creative stuff, right? Even the creative innovation stuff. There are enough opportunities in the in the process if it's sort of formalized to measure.
Right.
And of course, if you're a company like 3M, which I really love their idea of measurement, which was that X% of revenue every year will come from products that were invented in the last X years, Y years. That was pretty cool, right? But this is pretty, I think, something to take away, that because the instinctive reaction is that creativity can be a cover for indolence, right? And I don't want that to be the prevailing thought, right? So I just come to some questions. We are a little bit late getting into the questions, but maybe we take a couple of questions. So Nilanchi has a question, and she says, in a lot of organizations, there's an innovation hub, and I alluded to it a little bit. And I remember this even with a lot of companies creating a hub in Silicon Valley, and they think that that'll solve their problems, right?
Yes.
But that ends up being its own thing, and their problems with. So how do you see that? I mean, should companies put up a hub in Silicon Valley to innovate?
And expensive too, right? So the metaphor I would use is like the way that the D School is to Stanford, right? Stanford is amazing. The departments are amazing. The faculty are amazing. All these different domains, as you mentioned before, like some of the leaders in the world in their domains, right? So the D School is not, let's spin this thing out and tell us what the future of all this is. We're a resource for that, and we add our own abilities, hopefully at a similar level, right? That's the big challenge when you're working with other folks. But so faculty come and teach with us from their schools, right? They come in, they say, I want to teach in a different way. I want to teach in a project-based way. I want students to learn as they go. I want to partner with a D School person to teach, through this methodology. And we're going to try this out and see what we learn, right? And what we learn from it may, then find some pieces back into their core curriculum that they teach, or may not, right? It may just be an exploration. So, that model, right? The innovation lab is not filled with the people with the answers. It's filled with the facilitators of the way of working that's going to help us collectively get to new ideas. And that's how we operate, in my definition. Ask one of my colleagues, they'd say something different. That's the beauty of the D School. There is no D School. It's just us, the people, and how we work together. But that's, again, my my observation. But so it's like that, right? Whereas we used to think of like the R&D lab is let's put the geniuses in a room and they're going to come up with the new technology. It's the folks who are in the lab are facilitating the episodic projects, the people who are coming in. And so, what I know how to do is how to take a design thinking approach to, problem finding, problem framing, problem solving. But I don't know how to do what you know how to do, right? I don't have the expertise that you have, much less this multidisciplinary team. And so I'm going to help you work in different ways. And a lot of times it's managing the conflict of that collaboration, right? Recognizing that it's in the conflict that the new ideas emerge. It's in the collisions, and yet conflict is hard for people. So it's focusing on those behaviors and helping people work in ways that's going to get them to something different than they would get to if they were only working with people like them and their sort of siloed domain of knowledge. And I think that's what organizations should strive for too, is how do you create facilitation labs in a sense, right?
So
and yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. What happens then is that as those projects show promise, then you can grow the number of facilitators. As people on project teams come in, show an interest in skill for facilitation, now maybe they get to become part-time coaches, and so it starts to grow, and it really does look like a school of fish, right? Because you're replicating out.
No, that's a very deep answer, and I can see parallels, even in what we are doing, and it sort of gives me some clarity about what we do have some facilitation sort of groups and how to scale them. I think you touched upon constantly adding to them, and interesting, very interesting. One more question from Ajay, actually. You spoke about, you were a bit non-committal about mandating an organization design, right? Which I fully understand. And you sort of talked about there being multiple things you're trying to do with org design, explore, exploit, and so on. What about culture, right? So, any few words? So the question exactly is, what would you prescribe for improving and maintaining and improving culture as an organization scales? Any
Yeah.
key points?
Yeah. So one thing I've learned that's been really useful for me and about designing for culture is, first you start with the language. What do we mean by culture? So I think culture can't be prescribed in the sense that I can't tell you how to feel, right? If culture is what we feel about the work that we do and why we work for the company we work for, that's how I'm defining culture. So that's a good place to start, because culture has become such a ubiquitous term. It's like, internally in our organization, do we mean the same thing? What are we talking about here? It's like innovation. Like, what is that? That's jargon now because it doesn't have a clear meaning, right? So culture is the same way. So what do you mean by culture in your organization? So for me, if you can't prescribe how people feel about the work that they do for the organization, then what are your levers to affect how people feel about the work they do? There's a great framework that I use for that. It's called ARC, ARC. So the levers you have to affect your culture: the architecture of the organization, the routines of the organization. You can alter the architecture, you can alter the routines, and either of those will affect the culture. This comes from the former dean of the business school at Stanford, Garth Salinger. It's his framework. So architecture, pretty clear, right? We have new supervisor, or we assemble a new department or whatever. Of course, that's going to affect the culture. Routines is really more what I focus on. So the routines are the things that you do in your day-to-day. Many routines are explicit. It was in your job description, what you were hired to do, but there are also implicit routines, sort of the way we do things here, right? Anytime you're trying to change culture, by the way, and you run into someone and they say, hey, that's not how we do things here, I think the correct response is to say thank you, because I'm trying to do things differently. It's the only way to get to different outcomes, right? So thanks for letting me know, because a lot of times people try to shut you down. So remember, when you're trying to alter the culture, right, the antibodies in the organization want to maintain the status quo. And that is actually the norm. So it's not that people are being mean to you. It's not that they're, resistant to change. That's actually the normal behavior. You're the abnormal one. Okay. So I think it's helpful to sort of assume the good in everyone. Of course, that's not always the case, but if you can get to some of the behaviors, beneath their resistance, right, then you can start to open them up to doing things differently. So what routines do you want to introduce? Okay, we're going to create a multidisciplinary team around this particular project, or we're going to give people an episodic opportunity to work in a different way, right? Those would be pretty big investments. You could do small investments too, right? We're going to have, these Friday sessions where we're going to do, some different type of training or whatever, right? So organizations are full of routines. You have these already. If you've ever brought, donuts and pastries to the Monday morning meeting, right? That's a routine that you're introducing to try to affect a behavior, right? You want people to look forward to the week, or to show up for the meeting at the very least, right? Because there's donuts there. So thinking about that, but in a more, business context, right? What are the ways we're working that will affect how people feel about the work that we're doing? And so that's one way we go about sort of designing for cultural interventions, is how I think of it.
And that's again a question that sort of opens up a whole field of inquiry and
Yes.
discussion. But we just have an hour, and we
Yeah.
are close to the end of the hour. So maybe I'll just summarize some of the things you said, Justin.
Great.
Just because I think this has been really useful. I've been taking notes for myself as well. So the key things that I at least some of the key things that I heard were that the org design depends on where you are going, and then you reference the ambidextrous organization. I love the school of fish and emergent systems sort of idea that allows you to scale in a resilient way and stay creative locally, etc. You talked about the individual, and that for me perhaps is the biggest learning. Things about being comfortable with being creative, being comfortable sharing unfinished work, design thinking behaviors. You talked about creativity being measurable, right? And a process and language for creativity that allows you to measure what you're doing. I like the fact that, at least I don't fully subscribe to it, but the idea that people probably have to partition their efficiency time from their creative time It's provocative and needs some thought. Uh, really interesting conversation. And one thing which I would sort of maybe end with, Justin, is that what I've noticed happening at the D School is going from design of products to design of organizations that you're talking about. Um, I also think that we have an enormous opportunity to design for society. Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
And our social systems, our political systems are sort of broken in most
Yes.
countries, right?
Yes.
And it would be fascinating, if the D School were to just set aside a quarter of its time to focus on design for society, because I think that's probably far more important, or at least as important as designing better
Yeah.
products or for companies.
Yeah. I love that challenge. And in fact, that's really where we are. So we are working more on social systems now than anything else, for the reasons that you're talking about, that there are so many systems that are broken: education, healthcare, social justice, access to technology, access to poverty alleviation, all of those kinds of things. And in fact, that's where our heart really is. One thing I would just say here at the end is that, having gone through the last 18 months, all of us collectively, globally, have been affected. And when you think about that kind of disruption or that kind of challenge, we can often feel like we want to retrench, right? That we want to say, oh gosh, I can't possibly try anything new. I'm just trying to continue trying to survive. And that's normal too, right? But as we emerge from that, one of the things that's really optimistic about change is you can say, wow, how is human behavior different now? How is my behavior different? How is my community's behavior different? How is this community I'm trying to serve different? And how can I learn about those behavior differences? How can I engage with people to try to understand them as best I can? And then use my unique skills in order to help, or in order to, even help is an authoritative term, I don't mean it that way, in order to participate in the creation of what comes next. And there's an inherent optimism in that, right? Another thing that I sort of feel as I get older is, we all have different things to contribute, and it doesn't have to be competitive. If we contribute what we're good at, then together we can create things that we wouldn't be able to create on our own, and for each other, right? And so to your point about social systems and societal change, that's the thing that motivates me.
Justin, it's been fantastic to have you here, and a fitting start to our Sommelier Series. And really look forward to catching up with you offline. And thanks everyone for watching this, and look forward to having you on the next episode as well. Thanks, Justin. Thanks a ton.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.